Pharmaceutical Processing, in conjunction with INTERPHEX, presents INTERPHEX Live.
For the next 3 days, we'll be talking about the prime interests here, the latest and greatest in the technology area. We got a bunch of stuff we're going to be bringing up. And as the lead off today, we're going to talk about probably one of the most talked about technologies and product right now, and that is the CAR-T gene cell therapy. Okay, so that's our lead off. And today, for that, we have Adam from Celgene and Chris, again from Celgene, one of the leading innovators in this area. And Pat will also be talking about the facility support, and Aaron Weinstein will also be speaking about facility and design. But before we get into this whole thing with, right down into the nitty gritty and into the weeds, so Chris, Adam, want to kind of like, in a nutshell, what is CAR-T?
So I can give you guys an idea from a chemical engineer perspective. I'm not a biologist, so it might be oversimplified, but basically we're taking a patient's blood, isolating their T cells out, reprogramming them through genetic engineering, basically, to recognize cancer cells. So once we reprogram the cells, we expand them to a certain concentration, and then the cells are frozen and shipped back to the clinic and reinfused to the patient. So it's a therapy where they're using their own T cells, recognize cancer, and right now for mostly blood cancers, lymphomas, and that's the best that I can explain it right now.
All right. So what we're going to try to cover today is, this is new territory for most everybody. So what we're going to do is we're going to take it from a design and facility standpoint. So next up would be, let's talk about for a minute in a more general sense is, what are some of the design characteristics that become critical when putting together a CAR-T facility? I think people think about, what do I got to use? How do I got to make? The point is, what do I need to have? And I think that's where people kind of make their first mistake.
So, so when you first start out, it is a facility that in many cases, the team is very new to facility design, and particularly CAR-T facility design. So one of the first design considerations that we have is understanding the team that you have, knowing that in many cases the team is going to be a relatively small one to start out, and it's really important to have somebody on that team who's done some design around CAR-T specifically. And that really, one of the first design considerations, if you want to call it that, is getting together a really solid team with at least one person or two with a good understanding of how this works. Because in many cases, the people that are responsible for CAR-T facilities, or the ones that are going to be put in, come from a lab background and other backgrounds that aren't necessarily having all the information that they need for manufacturing. Some of the other general design considerations are, first of all, you're about to get a lot of pieces of equipment for a given facility. Compared to others where there are large pieces of equipment and maybe 4 or 5 for a given piece of equipment, you could have a list of 300 pieces of equipment for your facility. Because of the nature of CAR-T, which is really more of its lab and benchtop versus large-scale systems, that long list of equipment is something to consider. And one of the reasons why it's something to consider is that you go into equipment arrangement, which we'll talk a little bit more about. Equipment arrangement is a big deal. Again, because of the nature of it, you have to decide how you're going to create your rooms. Do you want an individual room that has everything you need for a given patient? Do you want a larger scale room that has multiple stations within it for the different parts of the process? So there's a lot to consider around equipment arrangement. And one more aspect that should be thought about is utilities. There's some different utilities that might surprise some folks when you're designing it. For example, liquid nitrogen is used almost like water is in other facilities. There's a lot that's used and a tremendous amount that's needed, and that's a little bit different. So early on, from that standpoint, those are some of the design considerations that you need to look at from a macro side.
So Patrick, from my standpoint, first thing hit me, I would be hit with is, can I just fix up a room and retrofit it? I mean, what's been your experience in that?
Yeah, so all the equipment going into these rooms, what are these rooms made of? And let's say you have an existing facility that you have construction in place. Can that be modified appropriately to fit this equipment? And I think some of that goes with where exactly is your equipment layout, and then how can you utilize the existing environment you have. So with modular construction, there's a lot available in terms of liner panels that you can use to actually go over existing walls, as well as new freestanding self-supported walls that could be put up to kind of create these rooms and dial off the separate areas.
So Chris, let's talk about scheduling, scalability. What are the challenges here? I mean, sounds like a great idea, but like for guys in the business that have to make it happen, I mean, what's the first bump you hit?
So I think the chain of identity with the product itself is very important. It's an autologous therapy, so the patient's cells are their own and they're going back to that patient. So it's not a mass production line like Aaron was mentioning. All the equipment has to be dedicated to that specific lot or patient. So when you're talking about scaling, you can't scale up. You can't just buy a bigger reactor. You have to buy more equipment. So you have to have a bigger facility or a bigger room or more equipment to be able to scale out the process. So the capability of the manufacturing suite is really limited by the size and the number of instruments that are in there, and then scheduling the number of resources, the people that can actually perform those functions. The scheduling team gets very, very granular in terms of what step in the process are they, what day of manufacture are they, what equipment is available, what suites are available. So it's a very, very tightly coordinated scheduling. There is a tightly coordinated scheduling aspect to production.
Let me ask you another question. I mean, one of the things in our industry that we're SOP, we're GMP, how does that start to come to play? I mean, what I'm hearing is it ain't your typical process. You got to make the room fit to what you need it now. It's not simply a gee whiz, let's retrofit. More importantly, how does like an infrastructure like a typically pharmaceutical based, like a Celgene, how do you adopt something like this? I mean, how does all of the SOPs and all this stuff come into play?
Basically, as that has been previously discussed with regards to the design, as Chris talked about with the challenges, you kind of have to mold your typical pharmaceutical laboratory into this nuance per se, because you're trying to make all kinds of laboratory pieces of equipment work in a manufacturing type setting. And with that comes the challenges of the equipment itself, where in essence they're not necessarily meant for manufacturing purposes, but you have to develop your procedures to be in an efficient manner to be able to control how you operate these pieces of equipment in a controlled fashion, to be able to track the product as it goes through the use of these pieces of equipment. So the development of these procedures are not only important as we try to create this new field of control, but it's also based upon the amount of user input we get as well, not only from the user's experience, but how they anticipate on using these pieces of equipment for their actual efficiency during the process.
So it's almost like a lab versus manufacturing mentality you're dealing with. That's
Absolutely.
A tough one. I mean, that's, to me, in certain cultures, that alone can be a roadblock,
And just around that, for example, laboratories, many of them are built around portability, the ability to kind of just move some things around and get things done. And there's going to be less of that in a manufacturing facility. So really understanding what needs to be portable, if it's indeed portable, and how you're going to move it and how you're going to track those changes becomes incredibly important. And culturally, it's a shift that some of the folks coming in, while very, very good at the CAR-T process, they also need to understand how to make those changes, how to get those done, and to understand maybe some of the limitations of the process and the ability to move things around. And around scheduling, just to bring one piece up around that, with all of those pieces of equipment, so you have the facility, you have the utilities, and then you have all of these pieces of equipment, and like I said, the list can get very large. In many cases, you've got people that want to get into the facility as soon as possible. You've got engineering folks that want to get in there and work on the equipment from a process standpoint. You have tech transfer, and you have all that. And understanding the phasing of how that works and how to get that through can make for a complex startup and qualification schedule, and one that you really need to understand and think about and try to work through beforehand, and also remain flexible as it unfolds, because things even more so than on other projects, there's real potential for change.
So Patrick, let me ask. So does I mean, again, I'm not an engineer. I'm a technologist, but just seems to be that modular construction, that's got to be a benefit here. Or?
Yeah, so absolutely. You hear about kind of how you'd have to stage up this process, and I'm no expert on the pieces of equipment and everything like that, but if it is done in individual rooms and then you're trying to scale upwards, these modular rooms are able to do exactly that. So you're able to change a 2,000 square foot room into a 20,000 square foot room, or a 200 into a 2,000. And that's kind of what's capable with the systems, and being able to actually break them down, add in additional walls. If you needed to create kind of a new layout, there's the flexibility to do that. As well as kind of a more important note with that is conventional construction, you can certainly do demolition, kick out a wall and rebuild it, but if you're trying to keep your facility up and running, modular is going to be pre-manufactured components that are able to go in, go up quickly, and not be as messy as conventional construction. So kind of some benefits there.
Well, let me just, I'm trying to get my head around. I mean, so what is, what has been your experience when you're used to working with equipment that's designed for a lab, and all of a sudden, gee whiz, and it's a hospital. I mean, we're not talking that now. We're talking, the rubber's meeting the road here. I mean, so so Chris, Adam, why don't you guys give me both your spins on that? You're up.
Yeah, the different perception that needs to be had with this type of concept is you're dealing more on a biological realm than your typical normal API drug product that you're typically trying to manufacture. So changing the mindset to utilize these pieces of equipment, and in some cases, you're trying to get on the edge of the technology with the new forefront of equipment that comes out. That we have the new and greatest piece of equipment. Will this be part of the new biological process? Because no one else has this type of equipment out there. And as you receive these new pieces of equipment, in some cases they're only meant for hospital settings, or maybe only for laboratory settings. So working with the vendors one-on-one and trying to determine how you best utilize a piece of equipment for a more controlled manufacturing setting has been one of the biggest challenges in trying to make these pieces of equipment systems in a manufacturing controlled setting.
I think to tail end on what Adam said, gathering the user's requirements can be one of the hardest things. They know how they want to manufacture the cells or isolate the cells or freeze the cells, but they don't know the exact parameters of the equipment that they want to use. So being able to have a close relationship with the users who hopefully are the end users and not a early phase clinical manufacturing group, or I'm sorry, a development group,
Right.
is important to have that relationship, so you can gather robust user requirements and actually qualify equipment that may be hospital-based or lab-based.
I get that, yeah. So I think that's the conversation we had earlier. You were telling me, URS. I mean, finally, okay, I get it. Let me ask you another question. I mean, aseptic process validation. I mean, there's got to be another one. I mean, that's got, like the CAR-T facility, that's got to be a one-off again. I mean...
Yeah, so the aseptic process validation or media fills, it's very different compared to a traditional filling line or something. The process here, CAR-T can take up to 2 weeks. So in order for you to simulate, do a media fill on a 2-week-long process, there are challenges around, do you have the time to simulate it all? Can you shut down your facility? Can you shut down manufacturing? How much of that process do you need to simulate? So I think you have to have a really good risk assessment on how the process runs, what are the risks to contamination throughout the different steps of the process, and assess the need to challenge the highest risk versus lower risk or no risk, and really try to streamline an aseptic process validation from a 2-week-long process to hopefully something far less than 2 weeks.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, so what you're telling me is, I mean, there's a lot of curveballs involved in the whole thing with CAR-T. I mean, there's hold times that you don't expect. I mean, is there anything else? I mean, the process performance anything else you want to share?
So going into a PPQ, I think the processes are moving and evolving so fast right now because of just the nature of the technology that getting the process to be at a locked state that the company's ready for it to be commercialized can be a challenge.
Yeah.
There are a lot of changes that people want to implement either from a facility standpoint, a process improvement standpoint, efficiencies, or de-risking contamination. Telling people to just stop the changes and lock the process so that it can be commercialized is a really, really big challenge to go into a PPQ.
Wow. So let's get back to, let's talk a bit about what I'm hearing about is specialized pieces of equipment, laboratory versus, let's pick up on stuff like controlled temperature units, incubators. This stuff, I'm just saying that because from a guy standing on the out, it's got to be something that's big in CAR-T manufacturing. So what are some of the CAR-T specific challenges that you run into with stuff like that?
Starting up with the new CAR-T manufacturing process, there's a lot of cold storage involved because it's all biological based, so you need a lot of low temperature CTUs, controlled temperature units. That includes your -20 freezers, your -80 freezers, even all the way down to the cryo units such as LN2 freezers, for example. And that's, as Aaron has mentioned earlier, the LN2 system is very important and critical to the overall process because with biologics and proteins, you need to freeze them at that low temperature to maintain them for a long duration. And that also touches base with scheduling as well. The challenge that you have in trying to utilize the similar equipment as laboratories, such as the -20 freezers or -80 freezers, is that you need to have a bulk amount of these pieces of equipment. And that in itself is all going to be based upon user input and the space constraints that each piece of equipment provides for storage, and efficiency with regards to space in the spaces themselves, the clean spaces or even the QC laboratories. So all those challenges all come together, and trying to find a proper way to make that work with the proper synergy is the really challenging part.
Right. But it sounds to me, one of the things what I'm hearing is it's a bounce between the equipment and where I'm putting the equipment. So it sounds like, in this case, so Pat, where I'm going with this one is, we're talking about cold temperature units. So like, when you're building the facility or whatever modification, how do you go about accommodating the options available for cold storage units?
Yeah, excuse me. So you'd have to look at first the temperature and humidity requirements within the room itself, and then what's required for that equipment within that room. So within, a standard laboratory setting, you'd have, a specific temperature and humidity you're trying to hold. But with some of this equipment, if it needed to be in a large-scale freezer environment and things like that, those are additional components that could be added into a facility and has to just be part of that planning process.
So are there standard designs coming about, or
So in terms of standard designs, it would be per process. So, based on everything that's being said here, equipment-wise and room-wise, the room would be structured and created around the process itself and the pieces of equipment needed. So it wouldn't be a room that you have to fit everything. It would be fit everything and then build around it.
For years, we're finally, as an industry, we're getting into continuous, we're getting into interchangeable. You got to remember, a lot of times, even in the small molecule business, everything was a one-off. So we're reinventing it. You see what I'm saying? We're right back to where we started from again. But I think we're smart enough now that we see that could be a major stumbling block. So it's good that we're thinking in that direction, because remember, it wasn't unusual to be in a solids facility that had 6 or 7 different process technologies. What's up with that? Well, it was like the flavor of the month. So let me ask you this. Developing and executing performance qualification. Let's talk about that again. Related to a CAR-T process equipment, what are some of the activities that you have to take into account? We heard about the facility. How about that part of it? Either one makes no difference. Don't fight. That's okay. Yeah.
The struggle with performance qualification, especially on your equipment and the new types of technologies, is that you don't have robust data on what is typical for the usage of that piece of equipment. The new technology and the new process, even user requirements, in most cases they don't exist because you don't know how that piece of equipment is going to be used. So the struggle is trying to find a simplistic method of how you can demonstrate the overall performance of that piece of equipment on an intended use. But in most cases, you're basing those on standards that the vendor may supply that shows the overall robustness of the piece of equipment because those requirements just don't exist yet. So it's a matter of trying to work with the users, developing those respective requirements, and trying to come up with something to properly demonstrate that performance of that piece of equipment.
I think one other thing, when you're in early phase construction or qualification of the facility, you need representative product to run your PQ on the instrument. And if you're talking about a blood analyzer or a blood separator, you have a brand new facility, but you don't have, or you shouldn't have, blood in the facility. So like Adam was saying, you know, they sell standards for bead sizes and different concentrations, but how do you run a PQ on something that needs to separate specific types of could be a very big challenge at the early phase of construction and qualification.
So Aaron, how are we dealing with that?
So, you know, in some cases, especially with when you have multiple pieces of the same piece of equipment or multiple of the same piece, you're really looking at taking a risk-based approach and getting a firm understanding of how of what you're trying to accomplish and how you can leverage testing that you do on one and not necessarily have to repeat it on the others. But that really requires a firm understanding of the risks-based of the risks associated with the equipment. And as Adam was saying, in many cases, these pieces of equipment are new. So inherently, to at least to a given company, the risks are higher because you have you don't necessarily know how it's going to work. So one of the ways to accomplish that is actually to try to build in your own engineering runs, your own time with the equipment to really understand how it works. This not only helps with operational testing, so that you're not taking something out of a manual that's more of a general thing that doesn't make it all the way through into setup. But also for performance qualification, it really allows you to understand how the system works its way all the way through. Even if you don't have, even if you're just doing it as a dry run or just an engineering run, those are doing that. Even though it can add 1 or 2 weeks to a schedule because you're really letting people just play with the particular piece of equipment, those 1 or 2 weeks will absolutely pay dividends on the back end by allowing the whoever's going to execute the performance qualification to truly understand how the equipment's going to work, and in addition, be able to eliminate some of the issues that can come up during qualification by understanding that the equipment does things in a certain path. And one other thing is to get the users involved early and often, particularly with the process equipment. If you know who's going to own a particular piece of equipment, it's best to get them involved, understanding how it works, and even executing the performance qualification themselves. And that way, by the time they hit operational status, whether it's for tech transfer or actual operation, those folks have a firm understanding of how the machine works and how to apply it to the process that you're given.
One of the other topics that we've been going to be covering extensively at INTERPHEX this year is the actual reality, virtual reality, augmented reality, and maybe it's reality, you know, that kind of stuff. Anyway, to me, one of the things that, one of the things that we always come to grips with in any process was, controlling, you know, like IT oversight. You know, how do you embed or institutionalize this into systems? I mean, how is this this has got to be somewhat unique. I mean, how do you maintain batch records? How do you maintain, you know, inventory? I mean, so can we touch on that? I mean, it seems like this is always going to be a one-off, or how does Celgene come to grips with that?
The tricky part overall with IT is that IT may not necessarily have the full GMP knowledge of what the laboratory and manufacturing floor necessarily needs. So it's making sure you have open communication between the validation department and IT to make sure that they're on the same page and the same understanding. And with those two groups, you need to include the third group, which is your stakeholders. Your stakeholders need to have the proper input so that all the systems are properly designed to be able to maintain the process workflow as anticipated. So with batch records, you're looking at a potential MES type system where you're tracing that product from the beginning when it's received all the way to when it's going to be shipped out. And you want that proper traceability, so including IT in every aspect with the proper firewalls within your spaces as needed, with proper communication tools, not only for the MES type system to trace your product, but to each individual piece of equipment that's able to be networked and be able to communicate with other pieces of equipment, including the MES itself.
So, again, I don't think we touched on it, but the CAR-T process is done in Cleanroom. So, paper batch records in a suite, a grade C or grade B suite, is not the most conducive environment. So, an electronic batch record, an electronic LIMS system that gathers data as well, is a potentially very important feature of the manufacturing process. So, getting IT involved early with the stakeholders that know what they need their batch records to look like, with what they know the LIMS system needs to do, it's important, but also keeping an eye on the validation and the Part 11 requirements, GMP requirements, because as Adam said, IT sometimes can be, not in the most GMP mindset. So having them involved early and making sure they're very closely tied to the validation group and the user group is probably one of the only ways to do it and succeed.
This would just seem to me that actual reality, augmented reality, visor, tablet based. This has got to be the sweet spot here. I mean, is that where it's going, or is that where you see it?
Yeah, I think so. It has to be in order to scale, speed of each lot. A paper batch record, there's delayed times to get the batch records issued, to get those batch records reviewed. The contamination risk of having that paper go through in and out of the clean room. Something like a tablet where electronic batch record is on the tablet. It's real time. It's got all the audit trails and real-time signatures. I think can speed up both the process and increase the compliance of the clean room itself.
Right. I mean, number one is keeping the amount of, if something goes wrong, it's also good that you keep the human traffic itself is your enemy as well, right? Having said that, though, so obviously our clean rooms have to be somewhat, we have to be able to expand and change with our business grows. And this is where we're going, right? And we're talking about, you got the ARV, but what happens? So we come back to facility again. So am I locked in? I got bricks and mortar. Now what do I do? I mean, so how do I expand? How do I address my business?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, that's one nice thing with modular is being able to actually scale these rooms accordingly. But something important about these clean rooms to keep in mind is also the fact that, the air handling units are going to be sized for the room that you're planning on unless you plan accordingly for growth. And so, speaking to the processes inside and everything that's being done, it's, the systems themselves need to be adaptable for the change, but you also need to make sure that you're planning in advance for any growth that's coming. So those are all capable and can be done. It just, along with the equipment you're looking at and the process you're considering, it has to be everything involved.
So let me ask you this, Patrick, it's more each room than the whole building, or what? Just help me out here. I mean, I'm sure
it's dependent on a number of things. I think that goes back to, more the equipment that you're trying to use within one room, and then how you want to try to scale accordingly, be it by the process itself. So I think the process is going to dictate exactly the size of the room, and be it, a bunch of little rooms or one large room. That's going to be, decided on the front end, and then it's just being able to adjust accordingly, and that's what modular will be able to do down the road. So if technology changes and they find that rather than a bunch of little rooms, it's easier to use in one large room, that's something you're able to reutilize a lot of the existing components with. So, but it would have to be looked at on that front end of what you're trying to achieve.
So the process train itself is somewhat disparate. In other words, you can't pack it all into one module. Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Right. Well, I mean, one of the ideal things for modular work was that, okay, so I can't get it all in one, but can I use it like a blocks? Can I move A to B and B to C? I mean, do you see that as part of?
Yeah, so one of the more common things is the scalability that comes with modular. So being able to, as you find that you want to actually do 2 processes in one room, being able to grow one room by, X amount of square footage to increase that process in there. So those are the things the flexibility that comes with using a modular system.
So let me ask you this from a validation and process qualification standpoint. I mean, it seems to me like the upfront to make it so that if I have 20 modules and I could fit them together to address, in other words, you have them built in such a way that by fitting them together I can address growth or not grow. It's this is the old scale out, don't scale up, right? I mean, this is the thing we've been preaching for years. So how do you address that? The validation, everything else. I mean, I know it's a rough one, but anyway. Take a stab at it.
So, when you're the key really from a design standpoint, when you're talking about the design of these facilities, you have to recognize there's 2 things. One, you're probably going to have a small group up front that's dealing with the design, and they are, and in some cases, they may not be around by the time everything's over and built. So, and I know I'd said this previously, but having somebody on board who kind of understands what they want to do, but really, better yet, is able to explain to the end users what the impact of the design is. So you're going to have individual rooms with all the processing capability for a given lot. A lot is a person. So one person, they give you the cells. The cells come in. Are they going to go to a single room? Are you going to have a very large room with multiple stations throughout it? Those questions really involve more questions, which is, giving people an understanding of what that can mean. A large room with a lot of doors, and you may be starting to increase. You're starting to think about pressure differentials and being able to keep those in a room. Sizing your HVAC accordingly. Can we make the rooms big enough to have an entire an entire process happen in the room? How are we going to get things in and out to the various freezers and refrigerators, and ultimately the cryo freezers? How are we going to move through that? And the impact of having those individual rooms. The larger room, you might be able to see some more flow of a patient starting in one part of the room and moving their way through the others. There can be refrigerators and freezers along the way. However, you now are dealing with the notion of having multiple patients happening in one room. And so, working with your quality group, giving them a firm understanding of what the impact is of the different options that are open to you from a design standpoint can really allow for a firm understanding of what the risks are, why we're going to, and really to note down and record why we've made those decisions. Putting those decisions down on paper and giving people an idea of how it's meeting the user requirements and how you want it is really important, because later on there's always going to be people joining the facility that want to understand why it got done this way. Maybe they had a large facility, or a large room where you circulated around. Maybe they had a bunch of small ones. Either way, if they come to a new one, you want to give them a firm understanding, them and regulators and anybody else, a firm understanding of why you chose what you did, how you understood the risks given for that room or your setup, and ultimately how you demonstrate and proved that it is compliant and meets your GMP requirements.
Russ?
So the facility design also has, I think it's important to consider downstream ongoing process validation. So the 2 different options that people are talking about are one big room that can handle multiple patients, or a bunch of little rooms that can individually handle one room. One of the considerations should always be is how are you going to handle your ongoing media fills? So if you have to shut your facility down or your suite down to run that media fill, do you want a individual suite, a lot of little suites that you can shut down as necessarily, or do you need to figure out a different approach to run a media fill in a large suite that handles multiple patients at a time, and adopt a strategy for that? So the downstream process validation, the facility design has impacts on, as well as chain of identity. So if you have multiple patients in the same suite, it's very, very important to be able to track one lot through its entire life cycle and ensure that they're not getting mixed up. So there are advantages to the small individual suites, but there's also advantages to a big suite with multiple lots in at the same time.
Have you done a risk analysis comparing the two? I mean, without divulging any top secret stuff. I mean,
Yeah, I wasn't part of that.
no, you wasn't? Oh, see. So no comment. Okay. I
No
got it.
comment.
Yeah, all right, good. You want them? So to me, it's what it comes right down to, it's really how much risk are you willing to accept? And, I'd be interested to see if somebody has done the exercise, to see if that was done, but, and share it. If not, don't worry about it. You want to take a shot or what?
Well, again, you want to talk as a general rule. That is exactly what the engineering group and engineering companies do at the very beginning. Is they do sit down and talk about the pros and cons. And really, when you're talking pros and cons, you're mainly talking about the risks for a given layout. And it really does depend on the individual company and what their experience is, what they're willing to do, and their background. But in the end, ultimately, the goal is to create something where not only is the company comfortable with the risks associated with a given piece, but also that their environmental monitoring and PQs and performance qualification and other aspects are meet the requirements and get through the testing. That is that is the proof that all of your upfront work panned out.
So Patrick, this sounds to me like, modular is a dream thing for this, but, there's always, but dreams are always driven by what you had before you went to bed, right? So what's the take on that? I mean,
No, I mean, the pitch on modular is a few things. One being just the flexibility that it would give down the road, and then more importantly, what I'm hearing is, there's still a lot of options that people are weighing right now when designing these facilities, and with that, the flexibility, and if you decide to change one big room into a bunch of small rooms, how can that be done without, shutting down the whole facility for a long period of time? And those are things that can be looked at with the use of modular. But, at the end of the day, what I see in general in clean rooms is just starting with the engineering process, making sure you're asking, what am I trying to achieve within this room, and how are we going to get there, and then building up from that. So,
I mean, do we look at similar industries? For example, I can't believe that, like a surgical suite. I mean, think about it. It's huge. But there is, each one of those are individually managed, right? So, I mean, does that teach us anything? I don't know, I mean, that's a yes, no, I don't, that's where I'm at. What do you think? What do you think, Alan?
The tricky part is that a surgical room, despite the levels of cleanliness it has to follow, may not necessarily be where we need to be on a manufacturing level, because you're dealing more closely at the microscopic level versus the macroscopic in a surgical room where you're exposed to more elements. Trying to maintain such a closed process, per se, to kind of keep everything in a sterile fashion versus in a surgical room where you're opening up the person at large there. However, the cleanliness of the rooms is definitely based upon like modular versus brick and mortar. There is a benefit to a modular type setup for the fact that when you have to expand, when you have to make changes to the existing brick and mortar structure, you have that dust element, you have that dirt element, and trying to maintain cleanliness and proper protocol to verify that you're doing your due diligence following any changes to construction to make sure it's properly cleaned is a particular challenge from my experience that we've kind of seen.
So when you're dealing with live cells, let me ask you this: are the current regulations and controls and air quality, is it good enough? I mean, that to me, it sounds to me like we're opening a new book here.
So I think it's again, it's risk-based, right? So we're dealing with a product that is not inherently sterile when it gets to us, and we can't terminally sterilize it either because that would kill the cells. So I think a lot of the theme is that you don't want to or contamination to the blood or the cells that isn't already there when you receive it. So, the cleanest environment that I think the processes have seen are the grade A biological safety cabinets, and that's where all the higher risk process steps are done. So the clean room environment surrounding that BSC becomes very important. Again, that goes to a modular or open design where one BSC can only have one lot in it at a time, right, to maintain that patient chain of identity and cleanliness. So kind of like the limiting factor may be the actual number of BSCs you have in that room or the number of rooms that you have a BSC. So I think the engineering controls that are around are sufficient for this type of product. It's just proceduralizing the controls around it in terms of the facility, the equipment, and the people working in that environment. How are they gowned? How do they clean? How do they handle aseptic manipulations? It becomes very important as well.
So, go ahead, Aaron.
And just just also the process itself, because of the nature of it, it really does lends itself to being a mostly closed system throughout. So you can actually identify very specific places where you might have a temporarily open system in it, but for the most part, these are closed systems where you use tube welders, tube sealers, etc., to make aseptic connections that allow the system to remain closed while you're doing it. So that's one aspect. So there's a lot of the single-use technology and things like that is inherent to this. And so that's one consideration when you're looking at the environment is, because you're using inherently closed systems, your environment should match that and allow for a certain amount of flexibility.
So we kind of know what we don't know? Or yes? Yes? Okay, all right. So the key, so the biggest, let's bring this around because I want to leave some time for questions here. But I mean, the biggest challenge, Adam, you're up. When you're in the thick of it, what was your biggest challenge? Take your shot.
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yeah, what was the biggest challenge you thought in your involvement?
So many challenges.
Well, just pick the one that, get you to bad
The
review.
biggest challenge in general goes back to the original design. When you design your facility to kind of take on that manufacturing level of the CAR-T process, you want to verify that you have the proper input from the get-go. And if you don't have that proper input, or you're dealing with maybe a small group of folks or who aren't necessarily going to be intimate with that process moving forward, you may not necessarily have the right setup in some cases, or you go through the whole construction phase and qualification phase, and you may determine, oh, well, this wasn't the best setup for this process. We may have to make changes now. So in essence, you're creating more work on top of the initial work of creating and designing the initial facility. So having that upfront user input is very critical when you design these facilities from the get-go.
Okay, I'm going to have to call time, but just on the CAR-T topic alone, I would suggest that you look at the live schedule, INTERPHEX Live. We have another couple of panels that are focused simply on this, primarily on the questions of environment and transfer. Okay? And I want to thank our panelists, Adam, Chris, Patrick, and my buddy Aaron here. Thank you very much.
Pharmaceutical Processing, in conjunction with INTERPHEX, presents INTERPHEX Live.